Yes, please proceed.
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm just going to share my screen quickly as well, hopefully. There we go. Okay, can you see that as well?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so I was asked to come here today to talk about Pillar 2 of AUKUS, particularly in the context of work I've done where I've looked at what I call Australia's military industrial academic complex. The Pillar 1 of AUKUS is in a lot of ways easier to grasp and easier to contest. It has a clear goal, and there's a lot more transparency around the developments, and the problems with it are quite obvious and easy to outline, including their cost, their contribution to further militarization of the region, the impacts on non-proliferation norms, nuclear waste management, among others. Pillar 2 is a lot more opaque. Broadly speaking, it is both a desire to integrate the defence industrial bases of the three states more closely together and to cooperate on pursuing new and emerging military technologies. So the kinds of technologies we're talking about here are things like AI, cyber capabilities, hypersonic weapons, quantum technologies, autonomous systems, and electronic warfare. So far, there's not a lot that has been publicised, developments happening under Pillar 2. We know that in 2023, the UK hosted the US and Australia for an AI and autonomy trial. We know there's been a trial of autonomous vehicles in Australia, and that there is a collaboration on development of a deep space advanced radar. So given that we know so little publicly, what we can do instead is look at the broader trends in Australia in terms of how they're pursuing military technologies. This is what gives us a little bit more insight into who the key actors might be, who will be involved in Pillar 2, and the ideologies and interests driving the pursuit of these technologies. One of the important contexts which is shaping AUKUS and also in turn being shaped by it is the relationships in Australia between industry, defence and academia. The idea of the military-industrial complex isn't a new one, of course, either globally or in Australia. It was first coined by Eisenhower in the 1950s, when interestingly enough, he originally considered calling it the military-industrial academic complex. Although he ditched the academic, which does make it less of a mouthful, when he gave his famous speech on the issue, he did talk a lot about the role of universities as well. In the US in the 50s and 60s, government defense funding was making up an increasing proportion of the funding available for university research. And this is what led him to warn that in his words, a free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. So when it comes to then looking at these relationships in Australia today, it becomes clear that universities are an essential part of this picture. And again, this isn't something that's new, but you can see noticeable changes taking place in recent years, particularly since around 2016. Around 2016, there were some shake-ups of various aspects of defence industry policy by the government. This included the then Minister for Defence, Christopher Pyne, announcing the goal for Australia to become one of the world's top 10 defence exporters. And while there was some sort of strategic thinking going on here, in the sense that this is how they're responding to how they perceive Australia's strategic environment, a considerable part of the motivation is obviously economic. So this plan has been tied from the beginning to a desire to renew Australian manufacturing, for instance. And this is something that has only increased under the Labor government. So various government plans released around this time point to this dual sort of strategic and economic vision, which is what Kanishka talked about as well, for Australia's defence industry. And they've also, in these documents, made the case for achieving this through creating closer relationships between industry, academia, and defence. So defence industry has shown a keen interest in this, in forging relationships with government and with academia. So you can look at sort of numerous quotes from senior industry figures. The managing director of BAE Systems Maritime Australia described this as helping to achieve what he calls an accelerator effect, the idea of working with local industry and academia in Australia. The managing director of the Australian arm of Elbit Systems has talked about how their partnerships with universities have, in his words, enabled the company's defence technology to remain cutting edge. And so it's really easy to find comments from various other senior figures, particularly from the big primes, outlining the importance they place on academic and local industry relationships. It makes it clear that they see them as sources of additional research and development capacity, of resources, and ultimately of profits. And at the same time, the dynamics of funding shortages in universities are driving them to increasingly look for alternative sources of research funding. Tracing their financial relationships with defence industry is difficult because there is a lack of transparency, but what is easy to trace is the increase in the contracts provided by the Department of Defence to Australian universities. So you can see this on the slide here. So this is the increase in the total number of contracts provided by the Department of Defence to an Australian university. And you can see that it really spikes around 2015, 2016. The second one is the amount of money spent, although it does have the two largest contracts removed, which are used to set up the Australian Defence Force Academy at UNSW. But once you've removed those, you can also see a clear increase over time, particularly from around 2015. There's also been investigative reporting from Declassified Australia, which shows the same trend exists in terms of funding from the US Department of Defence to Australian universities over roughly the same period of time as well. You can also see how interested universities are in pursuing these in the way in which they advertise themselves. So you can look on university websites and find all of these documents, which they call capability portfolios, where they're marketing themselves to defence and defence industry, talking about the opportunity that they can provide them. So I'll stop the share there because that was the only graphs that I had. But these are the pre-existing dynamics into which AUKUS was dropped. So it entered into an environment in which all of these actors were pursuing closer relationships with each other anyway, and in which the pursuit of advanced military technologies was a core part of these collaborations. And this created a permissive environment in which AUKUS would be easily accepted despite the clear problems with the arrangement. And it also meant that the immediate response from a number of actors was simply never let an opportunity go to waste. And so this is part of the reason it's important to interrogate the lack of a strategic rationale for AUKUS, particularly at the outset. A lot of attention has focused on trying to ask what AUKUS is for, but I think the more revealing question is asking who is AUKUS for, who is benefiting, who is driving this forward. And you can see this, the impact of this context from the day of the announcement of AUKUS. So you can see the actors who immediately saw this as an opportunity and jumped on it. Universities were particularly prominent in this. It took a single day before they started publicly stating their claim in news media as a central requirement to the success of AUKUS. The focus early on was understandably Pillar 1, given its concrete goals. So they focused particularly on how they could contribute to building the nuclear workforce. Key figures from ANU, UNSW, and the University of Newcastle were very quick off the mark to highlight their readiness and willingness to contribute in those early days. And then over the following months, there continued to be a number of public interventions by key university figures, either contributing to media interviews or writing their own opinion pieces about the contributions their universities could make to AUKUS. The university peak bodies have also involved themselves heavily, so Universities Australia and the Group of 8. They both submitted to the Defence Strategic Review, and the chief executives have both written extensively on what they see universities as being able to contribute. And they've tried to use it to leverage the government for more funding for universities, something which has quite clearly failed. Dynamics like this are playing out in the US and the UK as well, and I haven't traced these ones myself, but in thinking about the implications of AUKUS Pillar 2, and in seeking to contest it, these are the kinds of interests and actors that you need to be mindful of. When getting to the US in particular, the role of Silicon Valley and big tech is also an incredibly prominent piece of this puzzle. And these are then also the dynamics playing out as we see a lot of speculation about increasing the partners involved in AUKUS Pillar 2 and bringing other countries into the agreement. So I can talk a bit about New Zealand as one example, as one I'm familiar with, as I just lived there for 5 years. So there's been considerable speculation and debate in New Zealand about the prospect of joining Pillar 2, despite the fact that they haven't been officially asked to do so. Before the election in November last year, at least parts of the previous Labor government had been open to Pillar 2, and at the time the then national opposition had been quite sceptical. Since the election, they've diverged in sort of opposite directions. So now the Labor opposition is vehemently opposed and the national-led government is increasingly keen to join. As with Australia, you do see this dual economic and strategic motivation in New Zealand. Perceptions of the strategic environment play a role the same way they do for Australia, but the economic motivations are very clear, and they come through in comments from the ministers and in the briefing notes that have been provided to their departments as well. So the current government was elected in part on a platform of cutting public spending, something they've been pursuing quite ruthlessly. This includes having requested budget cuts from defence, even as they talk up the need for increased defence capabilities. And at the same time, like Australia, New Zealand underinvests in its research and development. So a briefing from defence officials to the previous government listed the opportunities they saw AUKUS as being able to provide for New Zealand's research community and their local industry. It's no coincidence that the current Minister for Defence in New Zealand is also the Minister for Science, Innovation and Technology, as well as the Minister for Space. She sees technology as a pathway to economic growth and has described technology and space as the key areas which offer opportunities to New Zealand businesses and scientists. The space industry is the key sector where New Zealand sees it could make a contribution. And it seems quite evident that, like Australia, New Zealand sees the opportunities in trying to sort of cross-subsidise their economic and strategic goals, hoping to achieve economic growth, new technological capabilities, more defence capacity, without actually spending any money on it. So just to conclude, the core to understanding how Pillar 2 will play out, I think, is understanding that these are the kinds of interests involved. My core message here is that we need to pay a lot of attention to the question I asked at the outset, this question of who is AUKUS for? And this allows us to then trace the interests and actors involved, understand their motivations, anticipate the developments, and contest them. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sian.